originally in Spanish, 2018.
With current space rocketry, could we cross the Van Allen bands?
You cannot cross the Van Allen bands with a jet ship rocket, because it maintains a 3D frequency that, when confronted with the 5D frequency, creates what from 3D is interpreted as a zone of high ionizing radiation that would literally cook the occupants and the ship itself in something several thousand times stronger than the inside of a microwave oven. The bands need to be bridged and can only be achieved with a ship that modifies the frequency of its interior and itself. The ones we call of total toroidal electromagnetic energy immersion, because you are then inside an electromagnetic cocoon that protects you from such radiation. This is also how ships are protected from space debris, dust, and rocks in space and other threats.
Thank you very much. So I can deduce that the modern man with his official technology could never have reached the moon. All missions were fictitious? But can unmanned satellites cross?
You are right. The flight to the moon of the Apollo missions is fictitious and was theater. Unmanned spacecraft like the Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft are real, but they are unmanned and have their electronics heavily shielded to get through the barrier.
All the people who still believe in the Apollo missions, this is something that we have talked about many times and it is very clear to me, but the excuse they give is that the rockets usually leave the atmosphere through one of the poles. Because according to them, the Van Allen bands are smaller or there are hardly any. What could you tell us about this? I am clear about it, but for those who are not so clear or more into official theories, thank you.
Just look at a toroid in your mind. You will see that the concentration of energy is the maximum by the poles. The artistic representation of the Van Allen bands always portrays them as open donuts at the extremes. They are not like that. The etheric barrier is total, and they are two energetic structures, one inside the other, reinforcing each other. The amount of radiation at the poles is much greater, and if you research the trajectory of all the Apollo missions, you will see that they never approached the poles. That information is online. So if they exited near the poles, the Apollo spacecraft, then they are lying to the public anyway. And on top of that, for an Apollo-type craft to exit by the poles means completely different trajectory dynamics, which would consume a lot more fuel because of the motion vector changes. And the ships barely had enough for direct equatorial flight. During their return, this would be even more critical, because to enter through the poles, the Apollo spacecraft would have to approach the Earth at a very steep angle, close to 90 degrees, which would make a course correction difficult, very dangerous indeed, or else it would burn up when entering the Earth's atmosphere. This is particularly serious in the case of Apollo 13, which supposedly returned by an incredibly small margin.
Well, they say that they were going through the poles to go around the Earth for a lap or several laps, and then they would exit with more momentum, in this case to the moon. You're right when you say that they would then have to come back through the poles. Thank you.
I am talking about the Apollo spacecraft during the missions.
That information, yes, it's online, right? So if they say that they exited through the poles, the Apollo spacecraft, then they are lying to the public either way.
You can go to the NASA site and study the exit vector of the spacecraft. It is equatorial, not polar.
Thank you, Swaruu. It is equatorial, not polar. That's where, in theory, the Apollo spacecraft would have to exit, not the poles, because of lack of fuel or too little fuel.
It's too much maneuvering to exit through the poles. Too many for an Apollo spacecraft.
And as we said the other time, in the hypothetical case that they crossed the Van Allen bands, which they never did, their DNA would be activated. Some people talked to me about Edgar Mitchell saying that when he came back from the Apollo missions, he became a very spiritual person. And I told them because maybe he had some kind of guilty conscience awakening about lying to the world population.
It's once again accepted Earth science and full of matrix titles with recognized prestigious institutions competing against a YouTube channel. It's just that it's not just the Van Allen bands that prevented them from leaving Earth. That's the most serious problem. But there are other serious problems. The free thrust of the Saturn V rocket is not enough to lift the hardware needed to go to the moon. Hardware inventoried by them. The lunar lander is unstable and impossible to fly. That washing machine would never fly. The lunar module could never work because it is an unstable spider that would need a super efficient computer to electronically stabilize that thing. Its size is too small to house 2 astronauts, much less with equipment and changing suits inside. The engine system is too small too. It can't escape the gravity they say the moon has. In parentheses, thrust versus spacecraft weight versus lunar orbital velocity. The lunar lander is the key to see how fake it is.
It looks like a washing machine. It's true.
You would need very advanced computers making corrections thousands of times per second to keep that in stable flight. And they just didn't have that computer technology. Your laptop has thousands of times more power than NASA's computers in 1969. And the computer on board the lunar lander had less computing power than your Casio watch with calculator. The prototype lunar lander never flew and almost killed Armstrong. How did it later fly 8 times without problems, including Apollo 13? Watch the video, it's only seconds.
Yes. Wow. Lucky he escaped. I didn't know that information. Thank you very much.
The Apollo missions are a technical impossibility. They never happened. You need anti-gravity technology.
And many continue to justify them. And if you respond back to them, you're ignorant.
Yes, you are simply ignorant. In my paper, which I have almost finished, I say something else that will hurt a lot of people, but it is the truth.
We want the truth, at least in this channel, no matter how much it hurts.
That nuclear power plants consume more kilowatt hours of electricity than they are supposed to produce. That's because they are not what they say they are. Electric power production is just a facade or excuse. They are plants for processing nuclear material for the weapons industry. But their main purpose is to be terraforming, to transform the Earth into a reptilian-friendly planet. I have detected researcher Laurent Mauguet also sharing this information, although my data comes from our research and sensors. Van Allen bands are the result of the manipulation of the magnetosphere as a result of the superimposition of another high-energy electromagnetic frequency. The magnetosphere is used as the energy source for the Van Allen bands. This is achieved by transmitting a high-energy frequency comparable to that of the magnetosphere, by changing it with the principle of dominant waves. The magnetosphere is the natural result of the presence of a large mass that acts as an energy dynamo. It can also be seen as the aura of the planet. As the dynamics of both the Van Allen bands and the magnetosphere are based on the toroid, they are superimposed. That is, both coexist in basically the same place, and since they obey the same principles, therefore the incoming and outgoing vortices at the poles are the points of highest energy. The equatorial parts are the same amount of energy as the vortices, but diluted over a larger area. So, leaving the Earth at the poles is trying to go where the Van Allen bands have the greatest strength or energy concentration per square kilometer.
Thank you very much. So this NASA graph, it would be a section of the magnetosphere, not the Van Allen bands? Look at these graphs. The NASA graph and mine.
The NASA graph, where you see two bands, one larger than the other, like a ship's life preserver, does not reflect reality in any way. It is wrong. There is no way to generate that without a vortex. So it would be on top, covering everything, like in your second image.
Which image is more real to you? What can you tell us about one and the other? Thank you.
The second one. The first are donuts or lifelines. They have no scientific validity because they do not obey any energy pattern. Your image reflects reality. NASA's does not.
The NASA image gives the impression that it does not affect the poles. When people see that, they think that the Apollo missions leave through the poles because there is less radiation. Thank you, Swaruu.
Sure, and it's more misinformation. Your image is fine. The stripes would indicate the course path of the energy.
Thank you. And the Earth within various energy toroids.
The white bubble where the Earth is would be the 3D, or the bubble where life can occur. And the Apollo space missions, shuttles and the like, only reach that bubble, never higher. Your image is super well done.
Thank you. I have questions from the followers and one of my own that I'd like to incorporate into today's video.
Okay, ready.
Okay, thank you. The first one. I copy the text and you tell me what you know or what you think. I think and believe that it's false, but I don't know how to argue that. Thank you. Surrounded by footprints on lunar dust rests a panel about 60 centimeters wide, covered with 100 mirrors pointing to Earth. The Lunar Laser Measurement Retroreflective Array, Apollo 11 astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong placed it there on July 21st, 1969, 1 hour before the end of their last lunar walk. 35 years later, it is the only Apollo science experiment still functioning.
It's all set up by NASA. I know that mirror argument and the related one. First of all, you don't need a manned mission to put a mirror on the lunar surface. If there was one, because it's not as they say, but that's not the point. The lasers they use diffuse before they reach the moon. Measuring the distance with the laser bounce is not scientifically consistent and is misinformation. A laser is not perfect. Light diffuses. It does not reach the moon, much less bounce off something and then return. There is no basis for that. It is part of everything that NASA puts together, lie after lie, all to justify and to make believe that they did go. Variant: photographs from Hubble, Mount Palomar telescope and the like, taking an image of the landing area, still with the lunar lander base there, and all that stuff, including footprints. Quick answer: the images are doctored. Yet another variant: photographs of the moon's surface from the Chinese orbiters. If the Chinese are antagonistic to the Americans, then what they present should be true, right? No. From above, China is under the control of the Illuminati of the same faction that controls NASA, because the Illuminati as such are fragmented today. There are factions that oppose and fight each other for power and control, and anyone with half a brain can see that what China presented are the same NASA recordings from Apollo, only reversed. Another point: the subject of why they didn't go to the moon can be exploited a lot more, because there is a lot more material. The point about the Van Allen bands is just the most damning one, but the list is long. About the bands, basically everything relevant has already been said about them. But the reason Apollo is bogus is because of many things, not just one. From motivation in the political realm of the time to lack of technical ability. The Saturn V rocket, while impressive at liftoff, and which causes people to see it as all-powerful and capable of taking man to the moon, did not have enough thrust or lift to get the lunar module and main spacecraft up. That's why they don't use it anymore. Otherwise they would still be using it, as the Russians still use their Soyuz spacecraft, in service since 1967. The US uses the Atlas, also from the 60s, but inferior. The computational capacity was insufficient for the necessary calculations. The lunar lander was unstable, impossible to fly, and too small to accommodate 2 astronauts inside. Its engine was weak and could not lift it off the moon despite the 16 degrees gravity. The spacesuits had no valid cooling systems, and the gloves were inoperable. They couldn't do anything with that on their hands. Not to mention that the set where the lunar lander is has no crater under the engine and no dust on the feet of the spacecraft. And there are recordings, supposedly real, from inside the lunar lander while it was being landed, and in those recordings the astronauts are heard talking as if nothing, and there is no engine sound, when the engine is right between them. If there was atmosphere inside the lunar lander, why don't they have a helmet? And even if there wasn't, the sound would be transferred through the helmet of the lunar lander. But you hear nothing, absolutely nothing. And that's implausible when the astronauts are standing on and next to a rocket engine with several thousand pounds of thrust. The cameras were impossible to manipulate with gloves. The shadows are wrong. There are multiple light sources when NASA insists they were not carrying lamps.
You are right about the cameras. With gloves, you have no feel for manipulating a camera.
There are objects placed there with footsteps around them, including the moon rockets as placed by crane. The camera rolls were of a specific Kodak type and were normal, corroborated, and the photographic film will candle or blur in the presence of high radiation, such as solar cosmic rays, not to mention the Van Allen bands again, and they show no signs of damage. The list goes on, and that's just mentioning the matrix reasons, what is known from there by humans themselves. In the list above, I don't include anything from here, such as the fact that there is no moon to land on. The engine on the lunar lander was 10125 pounds of thrust, like an F-18C engine or so. Don't tell me that it doesn't make noise.
Okay, thank you. Yes, you have talked to me about it on many occasions, but there are a lot of people who don't seem to see all of the videos, and it's about the actual lunar surface.
Swaruu shares several links with images of the lunar module and its engines.
Thank you very much for sharing. Evidently, it's all engine. You would have to hear the engines. They will always say that it was soundproofed. Can you give us a little description of what it would have been like to land on the actual surface of the moon, if they could have successfully crossed the Van Allen bands? Thank you.
It looks like this. It would be like landing on a surface full of junk, tubes, boxes, artifacts, protrusions.
Thank you. And it's all abandoned and in a state of total ruin.
That image is of the surface of the Death Star from Star Wars, which, by the way, Lucas was inspired here by the moon, because they know all this. There is nobody there, just autonomous systems. The moon is abandoned. Yes, John Lear says there are 250,000 people there. Not anymore. That was a long time ago. I'm talking thousands of years ago.
And this whole surface is covered by a hologram that will be separated by several hundred meters from the real surface of the moon.
Inside the moon are endless ruined corridors, like something out of a horror movie or like a horror space video game, Doom or Jet Space. Yes, it is separated. It is at just the right distance so that the desired effect is achieved as seen from Earth.
Thank you very much for sharing. So are the Nazi bases on the moon real, or?
No, Nazis, no. It had no inhabitants as such. It was a stellar base for distribution of goods, humans. It doesn't have any rocky or gravel surface. It's not a natural star. It is made of metal, and what they used was only a set, nothing else. Nazis on the moon, just the reptilians who also managed the Nazis. But that's not Nazis as what people refer to.
Thank you. I imagine all this knowledge is held by the secret organizations. Could we find some vestige inside the moon that would tell us the history of mankind?
Yes, they have it, and it leaks out to people in movies.
Thank you. The moon, we said, has been where it is for about 12,500 years, which is when the 3D matrix and the Van Allen artificial bands were installed.
Yes, at the same time and shortly after the deluge, which was not caused by Enlil, as the Sumerian tablets fanatics say. Something like that is seen inside the corridors of the moon, all abandoned, dangerous and disorderly, full of entities.
Entities? Dangerous entities?
They could be. Also traps and mechanisms put there by the reptiles when they dominated the area. It's not safe to explore that. Plus, it's huge. Just imagine how many corridors there are inside that thing. Rooms, vaults, spaces. Their reactors are primitive, ionizing, dangerous. The list is long.